about a place so cursed that even the wind refuses to blow through it? Where silence sits so heavy you can feel it pressing against your chest? Before we dive into this, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt like your family had secrets buried so deep that even mentioning them out loud felt dangerous? Drop it in the comments, because what I'm about to tell you might make you reconsider what bloodlines can carry through generations. This story takes us back to 1847, to the most remote hollers of eastern Kentucky, where the Appalachian mountains rise like the broken teeth of some ancient beast. That's where the Troxdale family made their home, if you can call it that. A place called Harrow's Gap, named after a trapper who vanished there in 1798 and was never found. The gap sat in a valley so narrow that sunlight only reached the bottom for about 3 hours each day, and even then it came slanted and weak, like it was afraid to linger too long. The Troxdale name first appeared in county records in 1831 when Mordecai Troxdale purchased 600 acres of mountain land for a price so low that the land office clerk made a note of it in the margin, calling it suspicious. Mordecai was a tall man, lean as a rail, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from hickory wood. He was 43 years old when he arrived in Harrow's Gap with his wife Sophronia, who was 38 and had eyes the color of creek water after a storm, pale and unsettling. They brought with them 2 adult sons, Gideon, who was 26, and Nehemiah, who was 24, both built like their father, all height and sinew and silence. The family kept to themselves in a way that went beyond simple privacy. They built their homestead 3 miles up a trail so overgrown you could walk past the turnoff a dozen times and never see it. The main house was constructed from stones pulled from the mountainside, dark granite that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Mordecai worked as a cooper, making barrels, but he only came down to the settlement of Millbrook once every 2 months to sell his wares and buy supplies. He never lingered, never made conversation beyond what was necessary for commerce, and he had a way of looking at people that made them suddenly remember they had somewhere else to be. Now here's where things started getting strange. And I mean strange in a way that made the locals uneasy long before anything overtly terrible happened. People in Millbrook noticed that the Troxdale men never seemed to age quite right. Mordecai had been 43 when he arrived, but 10 years later, he looked exactly the same. Not better, not worse, just frozen in time, like an image in a daguerreotype. His sons Gideon and Nehemiah also seemed untouched by the passage of years, their faces remaining smooth and unlined even as other men their age began showing the wear of mountain life. The women in town whispered about it over their sewing, wondering what kind of pact might keep a man looking 30 when he should be showing 50. But it wasn't just their appearance that troubled people. It was the pattern that started emerging, slow at first, easy to dismiss as coincidence until the coincidences stacked up so high they couldn't be ignored anymore. The first incident happened in 1834. A traveling preacher named Reverend Clemens came through Millbrook, one of those fire and brimstone types who saw sin in every shadow and damnation in every pleasure. He heard about the Troxdale family living up in the Gap and decided they needed saving, or at least needed to hear about the possibility of salvation. He rode up that hidden trail on a humid August morning, his Bible clutched in one hand and his certainty wrapped around him like armor. He never came back down. His horse was found 3 days later, still saddled, grazing near the trail entrance. The saddlebags were intact. His Bible was still secured in its leather case, but Reverend Clemens himself was nowhere to be found. The sheriff at the time, a man named Horace Vickery, who was 51 and had survived 3 knife fights and a bear mauling, organized a search party. They went up to the Troxdale homestead and found Mordecai working in his cooperage, shaving barrel staves with long, patient strokes of his draw knife. When asked about the preacher, Mordecai said he'd never seen any such man. His wife Sophronia, standing in the doorway of the stone house with her hands folded at her waist, confirmed his statement with a single nod. The sons said nothing at all, just stood there with their tools in their hands, watching the search party with eyes that held no readable expression. The searchers combed the area around the homestead, but found nothing. No tracks, no torn clothing, no signs of struggle, no blood. It was like Reverend Clemens had simply ceased to exist the moment he entered the Troxdale property. Sheriff Vickery noted in his report that the family's demeanor was cooperative but oddly detached, as if they were going through motions they'd practiced before. The case remained unsolved, filed away as another mountain mystery, the kind that happens when people venture into wild places unprepared. Except that wasn't the last time it happened. In 1837, a land surveyor named Phineas Garrett disappeared. He'd been hired by a timber company to map the ridgelines north of Harrow's Gap. His last known position was near the Troxdale property line. His surveying equipment was found scattered across a hillside, the tripod knocked over, the brass instrument showing no damage, but covered in a fine layer of what looked like ash, even though there was no evidence of fire anywhere nearby. Phineas himself was never located despite 3 separate search efforts that covered miles of terrain. In 1840, it was a peddler named Otto Schnell, a German immigrant who traveled the mountain road selling needles, thread, buttons, tin cups, all the small necessities of isolated life. Otto had a regular route and was known for his reliability. He always arrived in Millbrook on the first Tuesday of each month like clockwork. Except in June of 1840, he didn't show up. His wagon was discovered overturned in a creek bed half a mile from the Troxdale homestead. The merchandise was gone, the horse was gone, and Otto was gone. This time, when the sheriff questioned the family, Gideon mentioned seeing a wagon matching that description roll past their property 2 days prior, heading north up the mountain. Said the driver waved, but didn't stop. That was the extent of their knowledge, according to them. The pattern was forming, you see. Every few years, someone who ventured too close to the Troxdale property simply vanished, not killed in any obvious way, not robbed and left for dead, just gone, erased from the world as if they'd never existed. And now, if you're enjoying this deep dive into one of Appalachia's darkest family histories, this story is brought to you by Behind Dark Tales. If you appreciate the research that goes into uncovering these forgotten horrors, hit that subscribe button. And if you're hearing this somewhere else, just know they stole our content without permission. Help us out by reporting them. Now back to the Troxdale family and the mystery that's about to get even darker. By 1845, the whispers in Millbrook had grown into open speculation. The local doctor, a physician named Alistair Pembroke, who was 62 and had practiced medicine for 37 years, started keeping a private journal of observations. Dr. Pembroke had a scientific mind, skeptical of superstition, but unable to ignore patterns when they presented themselves repeatedly. He noted that the Troxdale family never sought medical care, never purchased medicines, never reported illnesses. In a time when tuberculosis, typhoid, cholera, and a dozen other diseases regularly swept through mountain communities, the Troxdale family remained untouched. He also noted the disappearances, cross-referencing them with his own records and finding that each vanished person had one thing in common, beyond proximity to the Troxdale property. They were all healthy adults in the prime of life. The preacher had been 39. The surveyor had been 41. The peddler had been 36. All of them physically robust. All of them simply gone. Dr. Pembroke shared his observations with the new sheriff, a man named Vernon Ashcroft, who was 33 and had been elected the previous year on a platform of bringing order to the county's more lawless elements. Vernon was not a superstitious man. He'd been a Union Army scout before settling in Kentucky, had seen the worst of what humans could do to each other during border conflicts, and he believed in evidence, not rumor. But he also believed in protecting his jurisdiction, and the pattern Dr. Pembroke laid out was concerning enough to warrant investigation. In November of 1845, Vernon rode up to Harrow's Gap with two deputies, Lester Kane, who was 29, and Raymond Stokes, who was 31. Both men he trusted to keep their heads in strange situations. They arrived at the Troxdale homestead on a cold morning when frost covered everything and the trees stood bare and skeletal against a sky the color of old pewter. Mordecai met them at the cooperage, still looking 43 despite being 57 according to the county's birth records, assuming those records were accurate. Vernon explained that he was conducting a review of unsolved disappearances and needed to ask some routine questions. Mordecai invited them to sit, offered them water from a clay jug that left a strange mineral taste on the tongue, and answered every question with perfect courtesy and absolute uselessness. He knew nothing about any disappearances. His family kept to their own affairs. They had no quarrel with anyone. They wished only to be left in peace. His wife, Sophronia, served them cornbread that was oddly dense and flavorless, and his sons Gideon and Nehemiah sat silent throughout the entire interview, their eyes tracking the lawman's movements with the patient attention of predators watching prey. Vernon noted everything, the too still way the family held themselves, the house that smelled faintly of copper and earth despite being spotlessly clean, the complete absence of family items you'd expect to see, no photographs, no letters, no keepsakes of any kind. It was a house that felt temporary, as if the occupants could pack up and vanish in an hour, leaving no trace they'd ever existed. As they were leaving, Raymond Stokes mentioned needing to relieve himself and walked toward the tree line. Vernon heard him call out, saying he'd found something. By the time Vernon and Lester reached him, Raymond was standing over a depression in the ground, partially hidden by fallen leaves. It was roughly the size and shape of a grave, the earth sunken in as if something had been buried there and the soil had settled over time. They found 4 more within 100 yards, all the same dimensions, all carefully concealed but visible to someone who was looking. Vernon marked the locations in his notebook while Mordecai appeared behind them, having moved with a silence that shouldn't have been possible for a man walking through dry leaves. He explained that those were just old root cellars that had collapsed, nothing more sinister than that. His smile when he said it didn't reach his eyes, and his eyes didn't reflect the weak sunlight filtering through the bare branches. They were absorbing it, dark and flat as stones pulled from deep water. Vernon wanted to excavate those depressions right then, but he didn't have the legal authority without probable cause, and sunken ground in the woods wasn't enough. He filed for a warrant, laying out his concerns in careful detail, documenting the pattern of disappearances, the family's strange agelessness, the suspicious graves. The judge, an old man named Cornelius Hampton, who was 73 and had presided over the county court for 40 years, read the petition and denied it. He wrote in his rejection that coincidence was not evidence, and that disturbing a family's property based on the sheriff's personal suspicions set a dangerous precedent. Vernon suspected that Judge Hampton was simply afraid that some deep instinct told him the Troxdale family was best left alone. But Vernon couldn't let it go. He'd seen too many things during the war, too many horrors that people refused to acknowledge because acknowledgement meant having to act. He started watching the Troxdale homestead, not officially, just on his own time, riding up into the hills and observing from concealed positions. What he saw over the course of 3 months convinced him that something profoundly wrong was happening in Harrow's Gap. The family moved at night, not every night, but regularly enough to establish a pattern. They would emerge from the stone house in the darkest hours, carrying lanterns that burned with a strange blue-green flame that cast almost no light beyond a few feet. They would walk into the forest, staying together, moving with purpose toward the northern ridge. Vernon followed them once, keeping far enough back that he couldn't be detected, moving through terrain he knew from his scouting days with the silence of falling snow. He watched them reach a clearing on the ridge where 7 stone cairns stood in a circle. The cairns were old, older than the family settlement, built from rocks that didn't match the local geology. At the center of the circle was a flat stone, dark and smooth, with marks carved into its surface that looked like writing in a language Vernon didn't recognize. The family stood around this stone and began to speak in unison, their voices rising and falling in a rhythm that made Vernon's teeth ache and his vision blur at the edges. He couldn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was invocation, summoning, a calling out to something that waited in the spaces between moments. Then Sophronia stepped to the center of the circle and cut her palm with a knife that gleamed dull red even in the darkness. She let her blood drip onto the stone, and where it touched the carved marks, the marks began to glow with that same blue-green light as their lanterns. The temperature dropped so suddenly that Vernon's breath turned to visible frost, and he felt a presence descend over the clearing like a vast, invisible weight. The air became thick, hard to breathe, and Vernon's instinct screamed at him to run. He didn't run. He stayed hidden, watching as something rose from the stone. Not a shape exactly, more like a distortion in reality, a place where light bent wrong and shadows moved independently. The family bowed to it, and it seemed to acknowledge them, though Vernon couldn't say how he knew that. He just knew. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it withdrew, sinking back into the stone like water, into thirsty earth. The family stood silent for several minutes, then gathered their lanterns and walked back down the mountain toward their homestead. Vernon waited until they were gone, then approached the stone circle on legs that trembled despite his best efforts to steady them. Up close, the central stone was covered in those strange marks, symbols that hurt to look at directly, that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when viewed peripherally. There was blood on the stone, dark and fresh, but as Vernon watched, the blood was being absorbed, pulled into the rock as if the stone itself was drinking it. Around the circle, he found small bones scattered in the leaf litter. They were too small to be human, probably from rabbits or squirrels, and they were polished smooth, cleaned so thoroughly that not a trace of tissue remained. Vernon counted over 100 bones, representing dozens of animals, all scattered around this ritual site like offerings. He took samples of the bones, scraped some residue from the marked stone, and documented everything in his notebook with sketches and measurements. Then he left that place and rode back to Millbrook with the certain knowledge that the Troxdale family was engaged in something far beyond simple murder. But knowledge and proof are different things, especially when what you know sounds impossible. Vernon went to Dr. Pembroke with his findings, and together they tried to make sense of it. The doctor examined the bone samples and confirmed they were from various small animals, cleaned by methods he couldn't identify. The residue from the stone contained traces of blood, human blood based on his limited testing capabilities, but also something else, minerals and compounds he couldn't classify. They debated going public with this information, but who would believe them? A sheriff claiming that a family of mountaineers was conducting occult rituals to summon entities from beyond normal reality? They would be laughed out of the county, or worse, accused of letting superstition cloud their judgment. Vernon needed something concrete, something undeniable. He decided that the sunken areas near the Troxdale homestead had to be excavated, warrant or not. If they contained bodies, that would be enough. If they contained nothing, he would accept that he'd been wrong and leave the family alone. Have you ever made a decision that you knew would change everything, that felt like stepping off a cliff with no idea what waited at the bottom? Think about the last time you went against your better judgment because something felt wrong. Even if you couldn't prove it, leave a comment about a time your instincts screamed danger. Because Vernon Ashcroft was about to discover that some families guard their secrets with more than just silence. On a February morning in 1847, when the ground was frozen hard as iron and snow lay in dirty patches across the hillsides, Vernon assembled a crew. Not deputies this time, but men he could trust to keep quiet and follow orders without question. There was Clifford Yates, a blacksmith aged 37 with arms like tree trunks, Elmer Sutton, a farmer aged 42 who had fought beside Vernon during the border conflicts, and Warren Doyle, a stonemason aged 38 who knew how to move earth efficiently. Vernon told them he was investigating possible remains on private property, and that discretion was essential. He didn't mention the rituals or the entities or any of the stranger elements, just that people had disappeared, and he had reason to believe they might be buried near the Troxdale homestead. They rode up to Harrow's Gap, carrying shovels, pickaxes, and determination. Vernon had chosen a day when he knew the family would be away. He'd observed that on the first Monday of each month, Mordecai made his supply run to Millbrook, and the entire family went with him, all 5 of them riding down in a wagon loaded with barrels and returning 8 hours later with provisions. It was the only time the homestead stood empty. They started with the first depression Vernon had marked, the one Raymond Stokes had found months earlier. The ground was frozen, making progress slow, but Clifford's blacksmith strength and Warren's mason experience made the work manageable. They dug down 3 feet and hit something solid, not rock, but wood, weathered planks that formed a crude box roughly 6 feet long and 2 feet wide. Vernon's heart was hammering as they cleared the dirt away and pried the boards loose. Inside was a skeleton, picked completely clean, not a shred of flesh or fabric remaining. The bones were arranged in perfect anatomical order, lying straight and formal like a body prepared for viewing. But there were marks on the bones, deep grooves and scratches that looked intentional, carved symbols that matched the ones Vernon had seen on the ritual stone. They excavated the second depression and found another skeleton, identically preserved and marked. The third depression yielded 2 skeletons lying side by side. The fourth contained 3. By the time they'd opened all 5 depressions, they'd uncovered 9 sets of human remains, all adult-sized, all cleaned to bare bone, all marked with those disturbing symbols. Vernon documented everything, took measurements, made detailed sketches. Elmer stood guard, his rifle loaded and ready, watching the trail for any sign of the family's early return. Warren examined the bones with a stonemason's eye for detail and pointed out something Vernon had missed. The symbols carved into the bones weren't random. They formed patterns, sequences that repeated across all 9 skeletons. It looked like writing, or maybe mathematics, equations carved into human femurs and tibias and ribs. Dr. Pembroke would later confirm that the marks had been made with surgical precision using extremely sharp instruments, and that based on the bone discoloration, they'd been carved while the bone was still relatively fresh within hours or days of death. They were reburying the evidence, marking the locations for official excavation once Vernon obtained proper warrants, when Elmer called out a warning. The Troxdale family was returning hours earlier than expected, their wagon rattling up the trail at a pace that suggested urgency. Vernon made a decision in that moment. They couldn't be caught here, not like this, not without official sanction. He ordered everyone to mount up, and they rode hard for Millbrook, not looking back, hearing the wagon wheels growing louder behind them, but never quite catching up. They made it to town and went straight to Judge Hampton's chambers. Vernon laid out everything, the excavated remains, the carved symbols, the ritual site on the ridge. He demanded immediate arrest warrants for the entire Troxdale family on suspicion of murder. Judge Hampton listened to it all, his weathered face growing progressively paler, and then he said something that Vernon would remember for the rest of his life. He said that there were some things in these mountains that predated law, that existed in the gaps between what was known and what was permitted, and that interfering with such things brought consequences no court could protect against. Vernon asked if that was a refusal to issue the warrants. Judge Hampton said it was advice, but he issued the warrants anyway, his hand shaking as he signed them. Vernon deputized 12 men, everyone he could trust who was capable of handling themselves in a dangerous situation. They armed themselves with rifles, pistols, knives, tools for restraint. They rode for Harrow's Gap as the sun began its descent toward the western ridges, painting the sky in shades of blood and brass. The homestead was silent when they arrived. No smoke from the chimney, no lights in the windows, no sign of the family anywhere. The wagon sat in front of the cooperage, still loaded with the barrels Mordecai had been transporting, but the horses were gone from the traces. Vernon organized his men into 3 groups, one to search the house, one to search the outbuildings, one to watch the perimeter. He led the house search himself, entering through the front door, which stood slightly ajar, creaking on leather hinges. Inside, the house was exactly as it had been during his previous visit. Clean, sparse, empty of personality. But now, Vernon noticed things he'd missed before. The walls were stone, yes, but between the stones were marks, the same symbols from the bones and the ritual site, carved small and filled with what looked like dried blood to make them less visible. The floor was stone as well, huge slabs fitted together with mathematical precision, and those slabs had marks too, a vast circular pattern that encompassed the entire ground floor, turning the house itself into one enormous ritual inscription. In the center of the pattern was a trapdoor, heavy iron with a recessed handle. Vernon called for Clifford, and together they hauled the door open, revealing stairs descending into darkness that seemed to absorb their lantern light rather than be illuminated by it. Vernon descended first, his pistol drawn, his breathing controlled despite the fear crawling up his spine like frost. The stairs went down approximately 20 feet, carved directly into the bedrock, ending in a chamber that had been excavated with incredible labor. The chamber was circular, maybe 30 feet in diameter, with a ceiling high enough for a man to stand upright. The walls were covered floor to ceiling in those carved symbols, thousands of them layered over each other in places, creating a visual density that made Vernon's eyes water when he tried to focus. In the center of the chamber stood an altar, the same dark, smooth stone from the ritual site on the ridge, but larger, table-sized, its surface worn smooth by centuries of use. Because Vernon understood in that moment that this place was old, far older than the Troxdale family's settlement, possibly older than European presence in these mountains. This was something the family had found and claimed, not something they'd created. On the altar were items that made Vernon's stomach turn, locks of hair braided and tied with leather, fingernails yellowed and brittle, teeth, dozens of them arranged in concentric circles, scraps of clothing, each piece labeled with a name and date written in faded ink. Vernon recognized some of the names: Reverend Clemens, Phineas Garrett, Otto Schnell. All the disappeared, their identities preserved like trophies. Beyond the altar, against the far wall, were shelves carved into the rock. On these shelves were journals, leather-bound and water-stained, filling 6 feet of wall space. Vernon took one at random and opened it to a page dated 1763, written in English, but with archaic spelling and phrasing. The entry described a ritual performed by someone named Obadiah Troxdale, Mordecai's grandfather, according to the family lineage sketched in the journal's front pages. Obadiah had discovered an ancient site while hunting, a place where the Cherokee refused to go, claiming it was cursed ground where spirits walked. Obadiah didn't believe in spirits, but he believed in power, and he believed that power could be obtained through knowledge that others feared to pursue. Vernon skimmed through journal after journal, piecing together a history that stretched back over a century. The Troxdale family had been practicing something they called the prolongation, a series of rituals designed to extend life far beyond natural limits. The process required sacrifices, not just animal, but human, and the sacrifices had to be vital and healthy, their life force somehow transferred through the carved symbols and the ritual stone. The journals described the method in disturbing detail. A person was brought to the stone circle, rendered unconscious through herbal preparations, then methodically drained while still alive. Their blood was collected and mixed with minerals from deep earth, creating a compound that the family consumed during the full moon. Their bones were cleaned and carved with symbols that bound their remaining essence to the family bloodline, creating a network of stored vitality that could be drawn upon whenever needed. It was grotesque, it was meticulous, and it had been happening for generations. But there was something else in the journals, something that made the murders seem almost secondary. The entity they summoned at the stone circle was real, not a metaphor, not a delusion, but a genuine presence from somewhere beyond normal existence. The journals called it the Witness, described it as ancient beyond measure, patient beyond understanding, and utterly indifferent to human concepts of morality. The Troxdale family had made a bargain with this entity centuries ago. In exchange for knowledge of the prolongation and protection from natural death, they served as its instruments, its means of interacting with the physical world. Every sacrifice they made fed the entity as well as themselves. Every symbol they carved strengthened the connection. The family wasn't just committing murder for personal gain. They were maintaining a covenant with something that existed in the spaces between reality, something that would continue to exist long after they were gone unless the covenant was broken. Vernon heard footsteps on the stairs and turned to find Elmer descending, his face pale in the lantern light. He reported that they'd found the family in the cooperage, all 5 of them standing in a circle around another of those marked stones, their hands joined, their eyes closed, speaking in that same rhythmic chant Vernon had heard on the ridge. His men had them surrounded, but were awaiting orders. Vernon gathered the journals, as many as he could carry, and climbed back up to ground level. The sun had set while he'd been underground, and the mountain night had descended with its characteristic totality, darkness so complete it felt solid. He walked to the cooperage and found his men standing in a wide semicircle, their weapons trained on the family, but their expressions uncertain. The Troxdale family stood exactly as Elmer had described, hands joined, eyes closed, voices rising and falling in that terrible rhythm. Vernon ordered them to stop and surrender. They didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge his presence. He fired a warning shot into the cooperage ceiling. The sound was shockingly loud in the confined space, but the family's chanting didn't waver. Then Mordecai's eyes opened, not like someone waking from sleep, but like shutters being thrown wide, revealing something that had been watching from behind all along. His eyes were black, completely black, no white visible, no iris, no pupil, just darkness that seemed to extend infinitely inward. He spoke, and his voice was wrong, layered somehow, as if multiple voices were speaking in perfect unison. He said that they had violated sacred ground, had broken seals that were meant to remain unbroken, had invited consequences they couldn't begin to comprehend. Vernon told him he was under arrest for multiple counts of murder. Mordecai smiled, and his teeth were too many, too sharp, arranged in rows that went back farther than his mouth should have been able to contain. He said that murder was a human concept, and they had moved beyond human limitations generations ago. He said the witness was coming, that the covenant required their protection, and that Vernon and his men would serve as the sacrifice needed to maintain the balance. The temperature plummeted. Vernon could see his breath, could feel ice forming on his beard, could hear the wood of the cooperage beginning to crack from sudden contraction. The lanterns flickered and died, all of them simultaneously, plunging everything into darkness, broken only by that sickly blue-green glow emanating from the stone at the family center. Vernon heard his men shouting, heard gunfire, wild and panicked, bullets ricocheting off stone walls. He heard screaming, wet and horrible, cut short with sounds like tearing fabric. He fired his pistol in the direction where Mordecai had been standing, heard the bullets strike something solid but organic, but there was no cry of pain, no sound of a body falling. Instead, there was laughter, multiple voices laughing in harmony, the sound of it scraping along Vernon's nerves like broken glass. He ran. He's not proud of it, he would write later in his official report, but he ran because every instinct he'd developed through years of survival screamed that staying meant death or worse. He stumbled through the darkness, found his horse by feel, mounted up, and rode blindly down the trail. Behind him, the sounds continued, gunfire and screaming and that terrible laughter. And beneath it, all the rhythmic chanting that never stopped, never faltered. He made it to Millbrook just before midnight, his horse lathered and trembling, his clothes torn, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the reins. He rode straight to Dr. Pembroke's house and hammered on the door until the old physician answered, lamp in hand, concern turning to alarm when he saw Vernon's condition. Vernon told him everything, words tumbling out in a disordered rush, and Dr. Pembroke listened without interruption until the story was complete. Then he did something unexpected. He went to his library and pulled down a book, old and leather-bound, written in Latin. He translated passages for Vernon, passages describing entities that existed outside normal space and time, beings that required intermediaries to interact with the physical world, families that served these entities across generations in exchange for power and longevity. The book called them the Between Dwellers, creatures that inhabited the gaps in reality, the spaces where one moment ended and the next hadn't quite begun. They were said to feed on life force, to be drawn to places where death occurred repeatedly, to form symbiotic relationships with humans who were willing to serve as their agents. The book described methods for breaking such covenants, complicated rituals involving destruction of the binding symbols, purification of the contaminated ground, and severance of the bloodline that maintained the connection. Dr. Pembroke looked at Vernon with eyes that held both fear and determination, and he said they had to go back, not to arrest the family, but to end the covenant before it consumed the entire region, because the book made clear that entities like the Witness didn't stop with small sacrifices. They grew, expanded their influence, demanded more and more until entire communities were corrupted and destroyed. History was full of ghost towns and abandoned settlements that had no rational explanation for their desertion, and the book suggested that some of those places had been consumed by between dwellers who'd grown too powerful to contain. Vernon wanted to gather more men, but Dr. Pembroke argued against it. More men meant more potential victims, more life force for the entity to consume. Better to go with just the two of them, armed with knowledge instead of just weapons, and attempt to break the covenant through ritual means rather than physical force. They spent the rest of the night preparing. Dr. Pembroke had materials in his collection, acquired over years of studying the stranger aspects of mountain folklore, things he'd never expected to actually use. Consecrated salt, blessed by 3 different denominations of clergy. Silver needles, inherited from his grandmother who'd been a conjure woman before converting to Christianity. Herbs that the book specified, yarrow and vervain and rowan, gathered under specific moon phases and dried according to precise methods. They mixed these materials according to the book's instructions, creating sachets and tinctures and powders, each designed to disrupt the symbols and weaken the entity's connection to the physical world. At dawn, they rode back to Harrow's Gap. The trail was marked with signs of the previous night's chaos. Blood on the ground, dark and already freezing, scraps of clothing, a boot still containing part of a foot, bullet casings scattered like seeds. They found the cooperage first, and what they saw inside made Dr. Pembroke vomit despite his medical experience, and Vernon's hands clenched so tight his fingernails drew blood from his palms. The 12 men Vernon had brought were arranged in a circle, their bodies positioned with ceremonial precision, and they'd been prepared the same way the buried skeletons had been prepared. Cleaned to the bone, every trace of flesh and organ removed, the bones carved with symbols and arranged in perfect anatomical order. It had been done in a single night, work that should have taken days, accomplished with inhuman efficiency. In the center of the circle of bodies stood the Troxdale family, unchanged, unmarked, their clothing not even disturbed. They were waiting, Vernon realized, waiting for him to return. Mordecai spoke with that same layered voice, said they'd been expecting him, that the witness had shown them his intentions, that everything was proceeding according to ancient patterns. Dr. Pembroke pulled out his first sachet and threw it at Mordecai's feet. The bag burst open, scattering consecrated salt in a wide arc, and where the salt touched the stone floor, the carved symbols began to smoke. Thin trails of vapor rose from the marks, and the blue-green glow flickered and dimmed. The family reacted instantly, their coordinated movement suggesting a single consciousness operating multiple bodies. They rushed toward Vernon and the doctor, their hands extended, their mouths opening to reveal those impossible rows of teeth. Vernon fired his pistol, all 6 rounds, hitting Mordecai's center mass with shots that should have killed him instantly. The bullet struck, tore through clothing, impacted flesh, but Mordecai didn't slow, didn't bleed, just kept coming with that terrible smile stretching his face beyond human proportions. Dr. Pembroke threw another sachet, then another, filling the air with salt and herbs, creating a barrier that made the family hesitate. They retreated out of the cooperage, running for the main house, for the underground chamber where the covenant's true center resided. The family followed faster than humans should move, closing the distance with every step. Vernon and Dr. Pembroke reached the house and descended the stairs, the family entering seconds behind them, their footsteps on the iron trapdoor sounding like thunder. In the chamber, Dr. Pembroke went to work with frantic precision. He poured lines of consecrated salt across the carved symbols on the walls, disrupting the patterns, breaking the circuits of power. He took his silver needles and drove them into the altar stone, hammering them deep with a rock, creating cracks that spiderwebbed across the surface. The journals on the shelves he gathered into a pile and set alight with a phosphorus match. Centuries of accumulated knowledge beginning to burn with flames that cast dancing shadows across the circular walls. The family reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped, held at bay by the salt lines Dr. Pembroke had established. But they weren't alone anymore. Behind them, descending the stairs with movements that defied physics, came the witness. Vernon finally saw it clearly, not as a distortion or an absence, but as a presence, a shape that hurt to perceive directly. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form stretching and compressing to fit through the stairway opening, its surface seeming to show different scenes from different angles, glimpses of other places, other times, moments of death and transformation frozen in its substance like insects in amber. It spoke, not with sound, but with direct insertion of meaning into Vernon's consciousness. And it was angry. The covenant was being violated. The instruments of its will were being threatened. The careful accumulation of power over generations was being disrupted. It demanded cessation, demanded surrender, demanded that Vernon and Dr. Pembroke submit and become part of the offering. Dr. Pembroke spoke back, shouting the words from his Latin book, incantations of banishment and binding, phrases that had been old when Christianity was young. The witness recoiled from the words, not in fear, but in what looked like recognition, as if it had encountered this specific defiance before. The burning journals sent up smoke that swirled through the chamber, and where the smoke touched the carved symbols, they began to crack and flake away. The altar stone, pierced by silver needles, started to split down its center with a sound like ice breaking on a frozen lake. The family screamed, all 5 voices merging into a single shriek of rage and pain and desperation. They launched themselves across the salt lines, accepting whatever damage that caused, reaching for Dr. Pembroke with hands that had transformed into something between human and claw. Vernon tackled Mordecai, both of them crashing to the stone floor with bone-jarring impact. Up close, Mordecai's skin felt wrong, too cold, too rigid, like leather stretched over something that wasn't quite flesh anymore. Vernon drove his knife into Mordecai's chest, felt it scrape against ribs that seemed to be made of stone, felt no heartbeat, no blood flow, nothing that suggested a living organism. Mordecai grabbed Vernon's throat with strength that exceeded human capability, began to squeeze, and Vernon felt his windpipe collapsing, felt consciousness starting to narrow to a point. Dr. Pembroke was grappling with Sophronia and Gideon, the old physician fighting with desperate strength, using his medical knowledge to target vulnerable points that should have disabled his attackers, but seemed to have no effect. Nehemiah advanced on the burning journals, trying to salvage what remained, but the fire had taken hold completely. The old paper and leather burning with unusual intensity, the altar stone split completely, the crack running from edge to edge, the silver needles tumbling free. A sound emerged from the break, a note so deep it was felt more than heard, vibrating through stone and bone and air. The carved symbols throughout the chamber began to fail systematically, the ones closest to the altar going first, crumbling to dust and falling away from the walls. The witness made a sound like reality tearing, a shriek of rage and loss, and it began to dissolve, its form losing coherence, the glimpses of other places and times flickering out like dying candles. The Troxdale family convulsed, their bodies seizing as if struck by lightning. Mordecai's grip on Vernon's throat released as his hands began to wither, skin tightening and pulling back from bones that were suddenly brittle and ancient. His face collapsed inward, centuries of postponed aging catching up in seconds. Sophronia, Gideon, Nehemiah, they all underwent the same transformation, flesh decaying and desiccating, bones crumbling to powder, clothes falling in on emptiness. Within 60 seconds, nothing remained of the Troxdale family except piles of dust and ash and ancient clothing. The witness was gone, pulled back through whatever aperture it had used to enter this reality. The covenant broken, the connection severed. Dr. Pembroke stood among the ruins, his clothes torn, his face bruised, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Vernon lay on the floor, his throat bruised and swollen, but functioning, his vision clearing slowly. The chamber was falling apart around them, the walls cracking, chunks of ceiling beginning to fall. The burning journals had consumed themselves, leaving nothing but fine ash. The altar stone lay in pieces, its power dissipated, just rock again. They climbed the stairs and emerged into morning sunlight that seemed impossibly bright and clean after the darkness below. The house was crumbling, stone separating from mortar, the entire structure collapsing in on itself with groaning inevitability. They rode back to Millbrook and filed a report that was mostly fiction. They claimed the family had resisted arrest, that a confrontation had ensued, that the homestead had caught fire and the family had perished in the blaze. The bodies of the 12 deputies were attributed to the family's violent resistance. It was a story full of holes, but it was a story that could be accepted, filed, closed. The truth would have destroyed careers, reputations, perhaps entire institutions. The sunken graves near the homestead were officially excavated, the 9 skeletons removed and buried properly in the Millbrook Cemetery under markers that read, "Unknown, victims of violence." The Troxdale property was left to decay, the house collapsing completely within a year, the cooperage following soon after. The land was never sold or claimed, existing in a legal limbo of unpaid taxes and unclear ownership. People avoided the area, said it felt wrong somehow, that the trees didn't grow right and animals gave it a wide berth. Vernon Ashcroft resigned as sheriff in 1849 and moved west to California, seeking distance from the memories and the knowledge of what existed in the spaces between moments. He never spoke publicly about what happened in Harrow's Gap, but he kept a private journal sealed and marked to be opened only after his death, containing the full truth. That journal still exists, archived in a university library, cataloged as the delusions of a traumatized Civil War veteran. Dr. Pembroke continued his practice until his death in 1862, and in his will, he left instructions for his collection of occult materials to be burned unread. The instructions were ignored, the collection sold to private buyers, scattered across the country. His Latin book, the one with the information about the between-dwellers, was last seen in 1897 in a private library in Boston. then vanished from all records. The stone circle on the ridge above Harrow's Gap remained undisturbed for over a century. Locals knew about it, but didn't approach it, passed down warnings through generations without fully understanding why. In 1963, a team of archaeologists from the University of Kentucky investigated the site as part of a survey of pre-Columbian structures in Appalachia. They documented the cairns and the central stone, noted the unusual carvings, took rubbings and photographs. Their report described the site as ceremonial in nature, possibly Cherokee or earlier, purpose unknown. Within 6 months, 3 members of that 5-person team had died in unrelated accidents. The other 2 refused to discuss the site or their research, and the project was quietly abandoned. The photographs and rubbings were filed away in university archives where they remain, occasionally examined by researchers who note the unusual nature of the symbols, but can offer no definitive interpretation. In the 1970s, there was a brief attempt to develop Harrow's Gap for timber harvest. Survey crews went in, marked trees, planned roads. Every crew that worked in that valley reported equipment failures, unexplained illnesses, a pervasive sense of being watched. 3 surveyors' compasses stopped working simultaneously and couldn't be repaired, the needles spinning wildly or pointing in directions that made no magnetic sense. A bulldozer operator swore he saw figures moving through the trees, tall and wrong, appearing and disappearing between the trunks. The development company abandoned the project after 6 months, citing geological instability, though no formal geological survey was ever conducted. The valley was left alone, and it remains alone today, a pocket of wilderness in an increasingly developed region avoided by hikers, unmarked on recreational maps. There are people who claim the covenant wasn't fully broken, that the witness still maintains some connection to that place, waiting with the patience of something that measures time and geological epochs. They point to the continued disappearances in the region, people who vanish while hiking or hunting in the mountains around Harrow's Gap. These disappearances are infrequent, maybe one every 5 or 6 years, easy to attribute to natural causes, getting lost or injured or falling into hidden sinkholes. But the pattern is there for anyone willing to look closely. The disappeared are always healthy adults in the prime of life. They're always alone when they vanish, and they're never found, not their bodies, not their belongings, not even footprints leading away from their last known locations. The Troxdale name appears in genealogical records until 1847, then stops completely. No descendants, no distant relatives coming forward to claim the property or the family legacy. It's as if the bloodline simply terminated, all branches cut simultaneously. But names can change, identities can be obscured, and some researchers have noted suspicious patterns in certain Appalachian families whose lineages show unusual longevity, and whose members seem to avoid medical records and official documentation. These are probably coincidences, probably nothing more than families who value privacy and have good genetics. Probably. The journals that Dr. Pembroke burned represented over a century of accumulated knowledge about the prolongation and the covenant with the witness. That knowledge is gone, destroyed in those flames in the underground chamber, or it should be gone. But ideas have a way of persisting, of being reconstructed from fragments, of emerging again when conditions are right. There are stories told in certain circles, academic researchers who study the stranger aspects of folklore, occultists who search for genuine power behind the symbolism, families who carry secrets through generations, stories about a method for extending life, for bargaining with entities that exist outside normal reality, for achieving something beyond human limitations. These stories always include warnings, descriptions of the cost, the sacrifices required, the danger of attracting attention from things that should remain unnoticed. Whether anyone has attempted to recreate the Troxdale family's covenant is unknown, or at least undocumented in any official capacity. But every few years, somewhere in Appalachia, or the Ozarks, or the deeper mountains of the Pacific Northwest, there are reports that sound familiar. A family living in extreme isolation, local people who disappear without explanation, symbols carved into rocks or trees, lights moving through the forest at night that don't behave like flashlights or campfires. These reports are investigated, found to be inconclusive, filed away. The families involved claim ignorance, offer reasonable explanations, cooperate politely, but provide no real information. And the investigations close, the authorities move on, the files gather dust. Vernon Ashcroft died in 1889 in Sacramento, California, at the age of 77. His sealed journal was discovered among his effects and opened according to his instructions. His family read it, debated what to do with it, and ultimately donated it to a university with the stipulation that it be cataloged as fiction, a creative work, not a historical account. They made this decision because accepting the journal as truth would mean accepting that reality contained possibilities they weren't equipped to handle, that the world was stranger and more dangerous than they wanted to believe. It was easier, safer, to call Vernon delusional, to say the trauma of what he'd witnessed had broken something in his mind and he'd constructed an elaborate fantasy to explain events that probably had more mundane causes. Dr. Alastair Pembroke's journals, maintained until his death, made no mention of the events in Harrow's Gap after that final night. He continued to document his medical cases, record his observations on disease and treatment, correspond with other physicians about advances in medical science. It was as if the entire experience had been excised from his memory, or at least from his willingness to commit it to paper. But people who knew him in his later years noted changes. He became more reserved, less social, prone to long silences and sudden startled reactions to nothing visible. He developed an intense aversion to darkness, keeping every room in his house lit even when empty, burning through lamp oil at a rate that his housekeeper found excessive. And he refused, absolutely refused, to treat any patient who came from the direction of Harrow's Gap, turning them away without explanation, no matter how urgent their need. So, what are we left with? A story that exists in fragments, officially denied, but persistently retold. A place that remains avoided for reasons people can feel but can't articulate. A family that vanished completely, leaving behind questions instead of answers. And somewhere in the spaces between moments, in the gaps where reality becomes uncertain, maybe something still waits, patient and hungry, watching for another opportunity to establish its covenant, to find new instruments through which to interact with the physical world. Because if the Troxdale family taught us anything, It's that some appetites never diminish, some bargains never fully terminate, and some debts accumulate across centuries waiting for payment. You think about that next time you're in the mountains and the silence feels too complete, when the shadows move wrong, when you get that feeling of being watched by something that sees time differently than you do, that measures your life in heartbeats and finds it brief and insignificant. The Troxdale family is gone, turned to dust in an underground chamber in 1847. But the witness they served, the entity they summoned and fed and maintained for generations, that thing exists outside normal causality. It doesn't age, it doesn't forget, and it might not be particular about which bloodline serves its purposes, as long as someone, somewhere, is willing to carve the symbols, speak the words, and pay the terrible price for power that humans were never meant to possess. And if you've ever wondered about your own family history, about ancestors who lived in isolated places and kept to themselves and seemed to have secrets they refused to discuss, maybe you should be grateful for that refusal. Maybe some histories are better left buried, some traditions better left broken, some covenants better left unmade. The Troxdale family learned too late that extending life isn't the same as improving it, that power obtained through suffering eventually consumes everyone it touches, and that some entities don't distinguish between master and servant, seeing both as equally disposable tools in schemes that span centuries. So, do you believe there are places where the normal rules don't apply, where older agreements still hold weight, where something waits in the darkness between moments? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you know stories from your own region, histories that don't quite make sense, families that disappeared under strange circumstances, share them. Because the Troxdale family might be gone, but the pattern they represent, the temptation they succumb to, that's as old as human ambition and as current as tonight's sunset. Until next time, stay safe out there in the mountains. Not all the dangers are natural, and not all the predators are animals.